So, if you're like me, you want to take a book or a movie and you try to evaluate like the entire thing, and maybe you're not like me, but I'll read a book, and if it's about something that's interesting, I want to delve deeper into it. If I see a movie that I like an actor with, I will look at what that actor has done and what they've been in and try to like look into things. So when I did the last review on The Yellow Wife by Sadeeqa Johnson, it told about, so it was a basically historical fiction based loosely upon Mary Lumpkin, who was the slave in The Devil's Half Acre, married or was the mistress to Robert Lumpkin. And I went through everything about how he had about 4 children with her, 3 of which went to Massachusetts and decided to stay and pass as white, while there was one that decided to stay in Virginia and not pass as white. Basically, she was very fair, but she decided that she wanted to stay and she was going to live her life as a black woman. Now, shortly after that, slavery was abolished, the Civil War occurred, and slaves were then freed. And Mary was responsible in founding one of the first historically black colleges or universities, which was Virginia Union University. And it first started as her renting the property out to a minister who would educate black men, and it went into the college becoming bigger and greater. So they gave her a lot of credit with that, since she leased the land out, and she was responsible for having the land in the first place because Robert Lumpkin had left it to her. Now, in The Yellow Wife, it was really profound for me because I saw the mixed race female story being told, which in most lights it's not usually, right? We usually hear about the African or the black woman or the black man especially going into slavery. So, and their experience and what they were told. So I, having read the book, wanted to read more about The Devil's Half Acre and more about Mary Lumpkins. So I found The Devil's Half Acre by Kristen Green, New York Times bestselling author of Something Must Be Done About Prince County. And it says the untold story of how one woman liberated the most notorious slave jail. And I was really fascinated with it because I really wanted to find out what was going on as far as Mary's story that was historical, not just in fiction. So I picked up the book, and the book is, I'm gonna go and see how many pages that is for you. The book itself is actually 273 pages. And then she has an entire, about 20 more pages of notes. So everything that she's listed as far as where she received her sources, how she found information, how it was historically accurate, is in about 20 pages. And then she goes into an index. She has an index to the book, and then also notes. So notes to why she printed what she printed. And I really, in reading it, Kristen Green is a white woman, and she is telling the story about slavery, and she's very careful in making sure not to say slaves or slave owners. She uses the terms enslaved and slavers. She deliberately chooses to not capitalize white and to capitalize black. And initially I thought maybe she's doing that because she is coming from a perspective where she's going to feel like she's being judged. And so in order for her not to feel like she's being judged, she has to kind of make accommodations and almost be apologetic in the story that she's going to write. And that's unfortunate. But it made me start thinking more about how that's really how any book that you read is about. So when you read like the Joy Luck Club, right? Amy Tan. It was written about the Chinese experience by a Chinese American. And if you read a slave story, it's written by an African American. If you read about a white story, it's written by a white person. And it's crazy that we can't tell stories, that they're almost segregated to tell stories about other races just because you haven't lived that experience. And so this book took her 10 years to write, with all the research that she did and visiting the places that, going to libraries, going to actual places, going to actual Virginia, to the Lumpkin jail, figuring it out. And so this came out a year after The Yellow Wife. And in The Yellow Wife, based on things that Kristen is saying, I can see parallels of how Sadeeqa Johnson in The Yellow Wife fictionalized a lot of the characters and added details to those characters based upon historical facts that Kristen Green is talking about. What I didn't like about the book was that it gave the impression that it was specifically going to be about Mary Lumpkin and her experience, and it turned into a major history lesson about slavery. And that is not why I got the book. I got the book in order for me to learn more about Mary Lumpkin and her experience that may have been more historical than Sadeeqa Johnson's fictional historical tale of Mary Lumpkin using Phoebe Dolores Brown as the main protagonist in that book. So, she specifically says that in her notes that I first learned of Mary Lumpkin, I knew her story needed to be told. She had suffered unspeakable hardships as an enslaved woman, enslaved instead of slave, but had also accomplished incredible feats, helping to free her girls and playing a role in founding a school that improved the lives of generations of Black Americans. But telling her story would be challenging. When I started looking for clues in 2014 about her life, I did not uncover much. So it basically said that she, in turn, had to use filler in order to bring a book about that is over 275 pages, 273, that she had to make filler with other historical details that told nothing about Mary Lumpkin herself. Now, she did some details about what she could find, but the jail had been buried. And so they did excavate, and so they did find certain artifacts. However, as far as handwritten notes or pictures of Mary, there were none. And diaries, were very rare. That I think in those days, the enslaved would be fearful of being caught and their stories being basically forbidden to tell. So they usually did a lot of word of mouth through generations. And I believe that's probably why some details are told, but not a lot of details are told. And a lot was secretive back then as well. I don't think that the daughters that she and the son that she allowed to pass as white in Massachusetts probably did not go around telling their lineage and that they were Black at the time, for fear of being sold into slavery or captured and imprisoned. So this was a secret that they kept, and they might have not chose to tell it to their children, and their children's children, and therefore, it is something that maybe future generations don't even know. Whereas with Sally Hemings, it was very clear that she told her children that Thomas Jefferson was their father. And there was opportunity to do DNA testing to verify that, which was found conclusive that he was. So when I started reading it, that was a part that kind of irked me, was that it was like, there were parts where it was, what would Mary have felt during this time period? And did she go see so-and-so that was captured? And so basically it's turned into an entire history lesson that I wasn't looking for. And although it's there's so much praise for it, like rescued from the horror of slavery and the neglect of history, Mary Lumpkins' life story in The Devil's Half Acre is one of tenacity, endurance, courage, and achievement. And this is written by Margot Lee Shelterly, who is the writer of Hidden Figures, best selling author, New York Times, of Hidden Figures. And that was a monumentous movie. However, I didn't find that Mary was spoken about much. However, I did put a few little nuggets that I did want to share with you. So the first being that slave trading goes back to the early days of recorded history, to a time when Nigerian Igbos traded their people as punishment for crimes. Europeans entered this establishment market in the 16th century, when the Portuguese purchased Africans who had been taken as slaves in tribal wars. Later, the Portuguese took their own captives from the west coast of Africa, and when they realized that was inefficient, relied on sales from Benin, where kings captured people from rival tribes. As other Europeans became involved in the slave trade, they purchased the captives who had been transported from the interior of Africa to the west coast. In the 17th century, these people were shipped to the Americas as demand for slave labor rose on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in Virginia. The largest number of enslaved Africans were taken to the Americas during the 18th century, and once they arrived, they multiplied. So clearly, slave trade was not started by the British. And reparations should not only be required and requested from the whites, as it was specifically stated that Nigerian Igbos traded their people as punishment for crimes, their own people. And the Portuguese purchased Africans who had been taken as slaves in tribal wars. Hey. That's really key. Another point. That I read. In 1784, the Friends of Virginia yearly meeting decided to disown members who would not free the people they enslaved. Robert Pleasants, a Quaker who founded the Virginia Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, a white man, had encouraged his father and half-brother to free in their wills the hundreds of people they enslaved. He believed that the laws would change to allow it, and after their deaths, when the Manumission Act was passed, Pleasants sued in Chancery Court to enforce his father's and brother's wills. He won, and some 400 black men, women, and children were freed as a result. In 1801, at his death, he left the people he had formerly enslaved a 350-acre estate and endowed a school for their descendants. So again, we have to look at history in its perspective, and racism in its perspective. Racism is not based upon one group of people deliberately holding another group of people back. there are many factors and factions regarding that. But again, and this is really interesting. So this is for free black people owned land, and this is on page 49 of which is brought forth follows the womb. Free black people owned land and socialized with white and black people. They were expected to pay taxes. Yet Virginia leaders became alarmed as the free black population grew from 1,800 in 1782 to 12,766 in 1790. So basically 8 years was more than a tripling in size. By 1801, there would be more than 20,000 free black residents. 1801, before slavery had ended. Free. And by 1810, just over 30,000. Legislators, fearful that the growing free black population would lead to unrest among enslaved men and women, considered how to define a black person by law. The sheer number of multiracial people, multiracial having one or more races, more than 60,000 in the colonies by 1776, made racial identity an important consideration. What would happen if multiracial Virginians started demanding freedom? And then another part that really kind of got to me was when I read this part on, and this is where I'm saying that this is how the book is kind of written. So none of that had to do with Mary Lumpkin whatsoever, specifically to her, right? So then it says, perhaps Mary Lumpkin experienced this kind of separation and was left without a way to find or reconnect with her family. The trauma of being taken from one or both parents surely stayed with her all of her days and shaped the way she mothered her children and later her grandchildren. The experience may have also played a role in her negotiations with Robert Lumpkin, making her more determined not to be separated from her own sons and daughters. So, therefore, this is more of a summation than it is a fact, because we don't know. Across the South, mothers were seen in cotton fields talking to children who had been taken years earlier as if they were there. The trauma of being separated from parents, siblings, spouses, and children would leave permanent imprints on the bodies and minds of those enslaved in America for generations to come. And that, I felt, was sad, because you don't know that experience of having a child taken and separated from them for the rest of your life, where you'll never see them again. And many of them were taken to different states and to different owners, and how would you know where they were? You just wouldn't. You really wouldn't. I mean, an enslaved mother toiled in 2 shifts. She had to work all day for her owner and at night for those who were dearer to her than life. Peter Randolph recalled of his mother. She would boil corn to feed her 5 children, and she would ask neighbors for cast-off clothing in order to dress them. When they had none to give, she would sit and cry over us. And that's in The Thing We Can't Name chapter. I saw a lot of stuff that was basically parallel to the Yellow Wife and friendships, which are documented that Mary would have had. And I'm gonna take a shower now. This was really interesting to read, with one of her friends telling her about her marriage. So Lucy Ann Cheatham is documented to have been a friend of Mary Lumpkin. And although Mary Lumpkin had a higher status inside the jail than Lucy Ann, she allowed herself to relate to another enslaved girl who was about her age to the benefit of both. And we can tell that Lucy Ann Cheatham was probably July in The Yellow Wife. And we never really found out in The Yellow Wife what happened to her. Which kind of made me a little disappointed in The Yellow Wife, because there were things at the end that were just kind of like hanging, and you either had to just guess or you just kind of had to let it be. There's another point, and I'm just basically mentioning, like, right now, the basis of what I did find interesting about the book. But when I got towards probably about maybe 200, I really felt like it wasn't going to be something that I would really know really existed. For instance, Mary Lumpkin did not live in New Orleans, but may have visited from Ohio. Before long, Annie Lumpkin would join her sister in New Orleans. In 1879, Annie Lumpkin petitioned the family's estate for money on behalf of William Edloe, Harriet Barber's son, who had taken the name of his late father. Robert Lumpkin had borrowed $600 from William Edloe just before he died, and he had given the man a bond in exchange. Edloe was ready to cash it. He and Annie, who had known each other for over 20 years by then, may have been dating. On September 15th, 1886, Annie Lumpkin and Edloe married in Manhattan. So they did have the marriage certificate. On the marriage certificate, Annie Lumpkin's maiden name is recorded as Littleton. Had she changed her last name to obliterate her past, or was it a mistake in the government records? Martha Kelsey also used Littleton to her son George's middle name. And on Annie Lumpkin's death record, Littleton would be recorded as her father's last name instead of Lumpkin. Again, what happened to Mary Lumpkin's sons is not clear. If Robert Lumpkin's namesake fought in the Civil War, he survived. All three men were alive in 1881, but by 1900, two of Mary Lumpkin's sons had passed away, and the third disappears from public records. He may have changed his name to George W. Lumpkins and moved to Bridgewater, Massachusetts, where he lived among the Wampanoag people and married a woman who had been born enslaved in Richmond. They may have stopped using their father's name. Whether they pass as colored or whites, I do not know, but I presume no trace could be found of them under the name Lumpkin, for in the very nature of things they would be more than willing that all records and recollections of their birthplace and pedigree should be blotted out forever, wrote James B. Simmons, the American Baptist Home Mission Society administrator, in an undated letter. If Simmons was correct, all of Mary Lumpkin's children removed evidence of their relation to Robert Lumpkin and the violence he perpetrated. Some also moved away from their mother's black roots. So in order to survive, they ended up having to basically, because they could pass as white, forget and cast aside any of their black heritage. So, I mean, just bringing it to a close, because I just kind of wanted you to know. She really concludes it right here on page 272. Little is known about how Mary Lumpkin felt about her life in Richmond. We don't know what her days were like in the jail where she was forced to live. We can't know how she viewed Robert Lumpkin. And yet her life, even in its erasure, is meaningful. It's meaningful to Virginia Union students and alumni. It's meaningful to her descendants, even the ones who are only now learning her story. It is meaningful to Richmond residents, and it is meaningful to women, particularly black women across the country and the world. I think that the important thing that we can do is to really tell our stories to our children, regardless of our race, regardless of the good and the bad. It is so important that history be told. And I think that with social media and the loss of family time, it just becomes more and more difficult. Our children move away from the concern of wanting to know about where they came from, and it's more about the moment and what's going on in the moment. I remember growing up, it was so important to me, you know, and I felt so honored, and I was given paperwork that I still have, you know, of deeds from the 1850s of my great great grandfather and his wife, knowing the history of how my family came from Arkansas and Louisiana to Michigan, and you know, and New York, and the jobs that they had, and my grandmother being one of the first women to work at General Motors. You know, these stories, how they brought their friends up, and then how our friends, you know, that they had became our friends, and it was generational. And now I don't talk to any of them anymore, you know, as far as the friends that I used to have that were family friends from so long ago, and so many of the older generation has passed away. And I look at my son who's 13, and I try to sneak in there a nugget or two about things, and you know, he's just like unfazed. And I think that I'll write it down, because it's where you came from and who your family are so important. And Mary Lumpkin's story was important. She was valuable, and what she went through was very real and was so important to be told. And we can only piece together and conjecture what she actually went through and assume what her feelings would have been under those circumstances, but we really just don't know. In the book of The Yellow Wife, it was her love for him was never really real. She just did what she had to do to get by. Her love for her children, you know, was solid, but as far as having to be basically forced to sleep with someone and have children and taken and ripped away from her home, I mean, how could she find love? And then we know from yet Sally Hemings with Thomas Jefferson that Sally Hemings had that choice when she was in France with Thomas Jefferson to come back to America and resume a life of a slave, or stay in France where she could be free. And her love for him chose to come back and force her back into slavery when she had the choice not to. So we just don't, it's a very complicated, very, very complicated history. It really is. And it's a fascinating history. But from the perspective of when you share a book and you write a book, it needs to be about what that book's about. And for all the pages that she had listed, it was almost like, for her and her perspective, it was important to tell the story and everything that surrounded the story, as far as everything that was going on in history from that time, from Anthony Burns being one of the most infamous slaves that had actually escaped and was caught and brought back to Robert Lumpkin's jail, to mentions of Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And while all of those were key issues and points during that time, that was not what the book was supposed to be. So because of that, I didn't like it. I didn't. And I like I said, I stopped reading it because, and I usually, you know, I'll read it regardless. But at that point, it was just like, it was just so much history. And that wasn't the purpose of why I got the book. So I hope you like this review, and let me know. I mean, maybe you'll read it and you'll get a totally different perspective from it. And that's what makes conversations and thoughts and feelings, and it makes that great. So I hope that you guys will take a look at it and just kind of give it a perusal and let me know what you think. All right, guys, till the next one.